All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Harris. I live up here in the South Fork Nooksack River Valley, which is in Whatcom County. And I'm really excited this work is coming together. I've been working on this issue kind of independently for a few years, but it wasn't until Sam and Stephen and a few other folks started really getting organized that I've started putting more and more time into this. And since I've been more engaged, I'm just realizing how much work and potential there is. I don't want to scare you away from the work, just to say that we need all the help we can get. There's a ton of forest to explore. And essentially tonight, what we're going to be talking about is how to be safe in the woods, how to navigate to some of the stands that we're trying to observe and record data about, and also just other general tips for field checking. There's actually a lot to it. Of course, a big part of this will be, will just have to happen in person. You're not going to be able to learn everything you need by watching a presentation via Zoom. But I think this will be helpful. And we are recording it so you can refer to it later or share it with friends who are interested. So a little more about me before I pass it over to Sam and she can introduce herself. I have been working with a few folks on a Whatcom chapter of the Center for Responsible Forestry. And the Whatcom chapter was really just trying to focus on the sales up here in this part of the state. So I know a few of you through that. I want to urge all of you to find others in your region to work with and kind of take a bite-sized chunk off of this work and continue working on it. There's just too much for any one person to know all the moving parts. So we're getting some momentum up here in Whatcom County, and I would hope others can continue doing great work down in the Olympic area as well as elsewhere around the state. So with that, Sam, do you want to, I'll share my screen, and do you want to go over our table of contents? And maybe you could say a few words about Center for Responsible Forestry and
Sure.
introduce yourself too. That'd be really great.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Lots of new faces on here. This is really great to see. My name is Sam Kropp. I am also a volunteer with Center for Responsible Forestry. I've mostly been helping with the field team, which is where my wheelhouse is. I moved up to Olympia last year from Eugene, Oregon, where I was working with Cascadia Wildlands, who are basically a wildlands defense organization and timber sale monitoring organization. And I helped them start their field surveying program in Eugene. And then when I moved up to Olympia, I got connected with Stephen, who is, doing this work on Washington state lands specifically. So I helped him start the Center for Responsible Forestry's field team, which is what we are here. And so we've, like Alex said, been really trying to grapple with the sheer volume of timber sales that we're seeing come out of specifically the Department of Natural Resources on Washington state lands. And our dream is to get this group, like Alex said, kind of robust enough to have sections or chapters all over the state that can kind of take on specific places and take ownership of specific areas that are being put up for sale. And so we know who to call, and we, if a sale is proposed in the Capitol, we know who our team is there. If a sale is proposed up in Bellingham, we know who our team is there. And we're starting to get to that space. So I guess before diving in, I would say that we're certainly not going to cover all that there is to cover. If you want to go to the field after this and you're excited to do it, please just get in touch with, Stephen, myself, Alex, and people will be happy to send you a list of places to visit in your area. We also can absolutely show you how to figure out those things for yourself, so you're not always having to ask one of us. But there's just a whole tons of places to go see. So I definitely encourage folks to go check it out. I think that's it for the intro piece. You can go to the next slide, Alex. Awesome. So what we are going to cover is the basics of what is field checking, what does it even mean, why is it useful, what our forest practices are, basically what is a timber sale and how does it get introduced and go through the process, and what role does field checking play in dealing with that. We'll talk about preparation for going into the field, the things that you should get together before you go, basic navigation, what to look for when you're actually in the woods, in the units, looking around, and then what to do with all that data when you're out of the woods, and how to follow up and make it meaningful. So those are the kind of big pieces that we'll be looking at here. And I should say too, like, our goal as an organization is to protect our legacy forests. And so we go into the woods, we deal with timber sales with the goal in mind to stop the logging of our older, not just old growth, but our older forests of tomorrow, our legacy forests. So what is field checking? This is an exciting question. Well, it goes by a number of different names. Sometimes people call it ground truthing, or field surveying. It basically just means going to a specific place that's slated for logging and seeing what is there, and comparing what you see on the ground with what the timber sale proposal says is happening in paper. So kind of matching up, if the timber sale proposal says this forest is, young and very crowded and in need of opening up or logging, then you go there and you see, is that actually, does it seem like that's the case on the ground? And then you use that site-specific information to engage in the process and advocate for places that are supposed to be cut. Next slide. So why do we do it? So you go out there, you're checking out places that are proposed for cutting. Well, there's a lot of different reasons. I'm going to go through them quickly, and we can talk, at the end if people have questions about the practicality and the use of it. But number one, like I mentioned, is to participate in the public process. Alex is going to talk about what that process is, but it allows you to give substantive comment when you're commenting on these proposals. Also, you can engage the public and build community. That's a huge one. So one of the main reasons that we often go into the woods is because, like, there's some folks on this call right now who live right next to the Capitol State Forest. And there's a community that was built in fighting a timber sale, or several timber sales in the Capitol State Forest. And so it's one of the most amazing ways to build community and get people engaged in fighting for our forests, is to go out there and see what's at stake. What else? And to tell the story. So this is, us getting, this was an article in a popular newspaper. So sometimes we can get journalists to come out and go to these places with us and get eyes on it. Building grassroots campaigns. So again, like, we can, build this information, stuff that we see on the ground, to participate in public education and protests and shine a light on the industries that are threatening to log the places that we love. I think there's one more. Preventing destructive logging practices from occurring in special places. So that's just we can win. Sometimes field checking, we can use the data and we can actually win. This is a picture of one of my favorite places ever in Oregon that we won, because we found it as an old patch of forest when the management body said that wasn't there. All right, to you, Alex.
Thanks. So I think a lot of you are already pretty well versed in forest practices in Washington. So just bear with me, because a few others I know are pretty new to forestry issues. At some point, we should just have a whole presentation with maybe a few other people doing the presenting who are more knowledgeable than I am. It might be nice to have an attorney just kind of go over some of the foundations of forest policy and law in the state of Washington. But this will be a pretty short and quick primer on forest practices. If you want kind of the next level of detail, still pretty cursory, but a little bit more detail, I'd recommend looking at DNR's Forest Practices Illustrated. It's a book that I actually have always nearby, that is helpful in some ways. It's not, of course, the final word on forest practices. There's a lot of rhetoric throughout this illustrated book, but it does have really helpful diagrams. If you're unfamiliar with what a type NP stream is, or what variable retention harvest is, or whatever. I mean, any of those like forestry terms are going to be defined very explicitly in this book. And if you go to your local DNR office, you can request one for free. You might be able to get one mailed to you as well. And it does exist as a PDF online. And so you can use that resource. I just wanted to flag that for you in case you were interested in digging a little deeper. So I wanted to define just a few terms. Sorry, this isn't like the most exciting slideshow. This is a functional slideshow, but it's not a super pretty one. So thanks for being patient with this volunteer effort. Gets the job done. So Forest Practices Application, Forest Practices Act. They're both FPA. And I feel like sometimes people forget that there's another FPA. There's actually two FPAs that are used all the time when people are talking about these things. The FPA is Washington's Forest Practices Act. It was passed by the state legislature and signed into law in 1974, and really serves as the foundation of logging policy and road building policy, chemical application policy in the state of Washington for everything relating to commercial forest practices. There's also forest practices applications. Those are called FPAs. And those refer to the documents. They're kind of like a permit in a way. They're not, but they're, just imagine someone who needs a permit to do something, they have to submit paperwork to the state reviews it and then approves it, right? And then the person can do the thing and they have a period of time when they can do it. Like I said, there's going to be another training at some point specifically on FPAs and how they work and what information you can get from them. But essentially, every single timber sale in the entire state of Washington, on private land, on state land, on tribal land, it all needs to go through the FPA process. And all FPAs are stored in a very 90s-esque database called FPARS. And I've posted a screenshot on the left. This is not a low resolution screenshot. That's like actually what it looks like. Like the website literally feels like you're surfing the web in 1998. And a part of that's because they're a state agency. They don't have money to update things. Let's be honest. Another part of that is they don't want to update it. They don't want to make it the most user-friendly possible, because it's only going to make their job harder if like literally anyone can just search any timber sale with ease. It's just a lot of extra work for them to make it easier and to make it more accessible. So at some point we need to change that because the state should be telling us very clearly what they're logging and what they're not. And I think this is a joke of a computer system. That being said, it does have pretty good bones. And if you know how to use it, and do a really great job. Bonnie, I'm going to mute you just because your mic is off, but I'm going to keep on going. One thing I will mention before I go to this slide, there is a really great map. And I will send a link to this in the follow-up email to this meeting. It's called the FPA mapping tool. It's essentially, for those of you who are GIS curious, this is a great way to dip your toes in the GIS world. Let me just zoom into where I'm at. You can just kind of mess around with this application and get some basic information about what kinds of streams are in your area and you know, where a timber sale is going to take place. There's a ton of information here. And this is where I live, so I'm just kind of zooming in on some of these streams. If I go up here, you can see water types. You can see other kinds of geologic information like unstable slopes, landslide prone areas. Gives you all the roads that you would need to know about and their status, if they're active roads, if they're retired, and whatever. And you can just mess around, you know, pretty endlessly on that. So I wanted to flag that. I'll send the link to that application in case you're interested. Moving on down through this list, some timber sales that occur on state land require a SEPA review. So you probably have heard of NEPA, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. It was passed in the early 70s by the US Congress. The state of Washington and a handful of other states throughout the US have passed their own state version of NEPA, and ours is called SEPA. And SEPA is exactly what you would think it is. It's a process in which proposed actions, either by the state or by a private entity, are evaluated for their environmental impact. And environmental impacts are either mitigated or they're deemed too significant and the project does not move forward. In the case of forestry, the vast majority of timber sales that we deal with do not go through SEPA. That being said, class 4 timber sales, I won't get into the details, but class 4 timber sales are the ones that have a greater environmental impact. They're either in a key watershed or they're in or near critical habitat for certain species, or they have other cultural value. You know, the ones that are a little bit more impactful trigger a SEPA process. And SEPA is a much more lengthy and comprehensive way to engage in timber sales. The FPA process is rapid fast. That happens no matter what. Every timber sale gets an FPA. And once an FPA has been posted on FPARs, it basically, you have like, I think 2 or maybe 3 weeks to comment, and then there's a decision, and then they almost always approve the FPA and it stays valid for 2 years. So that's the FPA. SEPA, on the other hand, gives you a lot more time to engage. And I actually don't know all the ins and outs of SEPA because I've never followed a project from the very beginning to the very end, but some of you probably have. This will also be a part of our training, the next one, to go through SEPA, how to engage with a SEPA checklist, how to submit technical comments during the SEPA process, how to, there's ways to initiate public forums, public meetings for certain kinds of SEPA reviewed projects. And there probably are ways to do that specifically for forest practices applications. All of that we'll talk about later. Just know that it exists and that some of the people on this team are already doing some of that work. So you don't have to be too worried about it. I talked about the environmental checklist. That's a part of the EIA, or sorry, the EIS, that's what they call it in SEPA, environmental impact statement. They have to go through a checklist and basically say, what are the impacts to water? What are the impacts to fish? What are the impacts to wildlife and whatnot? So you can get a lot of information about a sale by going through the checklist. This last item here is what I think is most important because it gives us the most time ahead of time to know what DNR plans to do. And that's their own plans. This map here was made by someone I think who maybe is on the call. Is Steve on the call? Yeah, Steve is on the call. So Steve, GIS master, pumped this map out, and I won't get into all the components that went in to make this map, but essentially we obtained information from DNR that shows over the next 10 years what they're planning to log, all the timber sales they're planning to log. Then we overlapped that data layer with another data layer, which was our legacy forest layer. So essentially all forest over 75 years that meet certain criteria that we established for what legacy forest is. And the overlap was this map. And this is only our part of the state. It's only for this year and next year, timber sales that are being sold now or next year. And just in the corner of the state where I live, look, there's a few dozen just right there. Oh, in the next 2 years, legacy forest is on the chopping block. Ever since the Marble Merlet Conservation Strategy was finalized in 2019, there's been a major shift in the Department of Natural Resources to logging older forest. And we can get into the details later. Just know that old forest is once again being cut in the state of Washington. Some of this forest is up to 150 years old. And I was just at a sale a few weeks ago that's actually actively being logged. It's about 125 years old and it's in the Lake Whatcom watershed. So this is all right here. And if you're down in Olympia or if you're in the Olympic Peninsula, there's probably stuff in your backyard just like this. So the goal is to produce maps like this for every part of the state so that each part of the state has their own priority map of like the lowest hanging fruit, the stuff that's going to be cut soon and the stuff that is legacy forest. We'll get a little bit more into navigation later, but when you're going through FPAs, you actually have access to a lot of really great maps. And this is what the maps usually look like. They're good in some ways, they're kind of bad in others. They usually like cut off a timber sale awkwardly, like right in the middle. They also don't really show you context. They don't like zoom out and like, they usually don't. Sometimes they'll have a vicinity map, but usually they'll like zoom way in and you need to look up the township and the section. You need to basically have an FPA mapping tool, that thing I showed you earlier. You need to have that up to like figure out where these timber sales are. Pretty stupid, but this is another way to get information about FPAs. When you're looking at those maps, some of those common acronyms are right of way, variable retention harvest, variable density thinning, wetland management zone, and the RMZ, riparian management zone, is used all the time. So these are just some of the acronyms you're going to run into in those FPAs. I like to use aerial footage and photographs to complement some of my mapping before I visit a sale. It really helps to see visually what kind of forest you're dealing with. And surprisingly, you actually can learn a lot about a forest by looking at it from a satellite. If you actually get the layers, I recommend always just messing around with aerial photographs to get more data and more information. So Sam, do you want to take us through some of the prep and safety tips?
Definitely. And there's some good questions and conversation happening in the chat that maybe you can add to Alex, specifically something about what determines SEPA eligibility. But yes, to reiterate, we do have folks who are working on monitoring all the timber sales, so you don't need to do that. It's just good to be able to at least like look up the timber sale yourself. And if you want to dig through the documents to know where to get them, it's good to be self-sufficient in that way. But we have people who are monitoring every single sale that comes out of DNR. So we're not missing anything. Okay, so this is like the stuff that you want to do before you go into the unit or before you go into the sale. So you obviously identified which timber sale you want to go to. One of the things that I don't have in this presentation, but it's worth mentioning, is also, thinking about what units you want to go to. So like, Alex kind of just covered that using the LiDAR, but also figuring out road accesses. So you want to look at, transportation maps to make sure you can access the places you want to go. But when you're ready to go and you know where you're going, you want to throw together your bag. And so I'm not going to read every single thing on this list, but this is a good reference list. We have it around and can continue to send it around. Some of the things on here are the tools that we use for field checking. So compass, camera is probably your most important tool for documentation. Photos. One of the important things to say with photos is like you always want to have a scale, photo to scale. So if you're alone, which you probably shouldn't be in the deep woods off trail, but you could use a backpack or something by a tree to show the size. If you're with other people, make sure that you put people in the picture so you can see the scale of photos. But that's the most important thing, is your camera. We have gear with Center for Responsible Forestry that we can loan out, including diameter tape and things like that. But this is just kind of a good list. Rule of thumb for me is, even if I know I'm just going out for the day, I always bring stuff that I might need if I have to spend an accidental night in the woods. So pack as if you're going on an adventure, on an expedition. Okay. Safety third. Just kidding, safety first. Safety is really important. We talk about it all the time. We do have liability waivers. We can like see, oh, that was interesting. Something popped up on the screen, but now it's gone. We have liability waivers that we're asking every single person who goes into the woods to fill out. So let us know if you need to see those or you need to fill them out, just to cover the Center for Responsible Forestry. If anything does happen, like I mentioned, don't go alone if you can help it. Sometimes it happens, sometimes we do it. If you do go alone, and if you don't, if you go with a group, regardless, make sure you tell others where you're going, and give them some specifics. I like to give my friends an actual lat long point, because it's hard to describe the exact location of the places that are on Forest Service roads. And then a timeline. If you don't hear from me by X, you should be worried. Because we are off trail. We're not following trails. We're not on, paved roads. We're totally in the woods. Don't be surprised by wild animals. We put that in there because, it's not unheard of that it can happen. You can run into a bear, a cougar, have a plan for that. There's a lot of different ways to stay safe in those situations, but mostly don't, have a plan going in, and don't be surprised if that happens. Watch your head and watch your feet. Most common ways to get hurt in the woods is tripping and falling. Lots of dead and downed wood in the woods. Also falling wood, and especially in some of the younger forests, is a lot of like ladder fuels and things dying and falling. So sometimes people wear hard hats, but always good to just be aware of, are you standing underneath a widowmaker right now? What's above you and what's below you? Don't be intoxicated. That goes without saying. It can be seriously dangerous and hard to navigate. So got to have your wits about you. And like I mentioned before, bring everything you need and a little bit more. So you get to the unit, you get to the place that you're going in the timber sale. Before you rush out of the car and into the forest, it's really good to just do a quick centering check before you dive in. First of all, assuming you're with others, look at a map together and agree where you are on the map so that you all agree, where the car is, and then agree on the route that you're going to take to see the whole unit. Ideally, you can see as much of it as possible because it can change so much just from moment to moment. So you really want to make a plan to try and see as much as you can, but take a look at the topography. Try and figure out what your easiest access points are. Don't send yourself falling down a ridge. Make a plan for how you're going to get in and get out and see what you want to see. One thing that we do that's a good practice is with whatever phone you're going to be taking pictures of the unit, go ahead and the first picture you take before you walk in is a picture of the map itself with your finger pointing to the unit on the map that you are about to walk into. And the reason that we do that is because then every single picture that comes after that is easily identifiable as in that unit. So many times it's really easy to take a bunch of good pictures and then you get home and you're like, I don't remember where I took those. And sure, there is good photo locating at this point, but that's an extra technological step that you don't have to take if you just do that first part. So take a picture of where you're going in. And then when I'm in a group, I always assign group roles. It makes it so much easier, and it makes sure that you're not going to get anything lost. So we always have a navigator. That person is tracking where we are on GIS, is also using a compass to make sure that you're heading in the direction you want to be heading in, and is just consistently making sure that you're on the right track. Another person is an Avenza data collector. So Alex is going to talk about how to use Avenza, but that's just the person who, anytime you see a place-specific thing that you need to mark the location of, then you drop a pin and it stays in Avenza. So there's someone who's just making sure everything is collected that way. I like to have a person who's responsible for the measurements. And so there's different measurements that we take in the field. We measure tree diameter. Sometimes we measure canopy cover, which can be a good indicator of the type of forest that you're in. And sometimes we'll measure slope, although that's less common in Washington than in Oregon forests. But if you're on a really steep slope, sometimes it's good to have an understanding of just how steep. And then a note taker. So someone who's just pen and pencil and clipboard, taking notes, writing things down. It can be stream of conscience, but as people are noticing plants or site characteristics, that person is just taking notes and recording everything. All right, navigation.
All right. I think most people on this Zoom call and folks who are watching the recording, you're probably all forest people, so you probably all have some semblance of navigation skills. That being said, sometimes it's surprising when people will ask me, like, we're in like the woods, and they're like, okay, I have no idea which way we just came from. And I'm like, oh shoot, like it's not intuitive to everyone. So even if you are one of those people who are like, oh, it's super intuitive, people can get turned around, and it's good to have a, some tips and some just rules of thumb whenever you're navigating off trail through shrubbery in these timber sales. So I'll be going through these pretty quickly because some of them are pretty intuitive. Don't go into the woods to go field checking if you are alone, when the weather is bad and visibility is poor, when you don't have a map, or at least if you have like a decent map, sometimes that can be okay, but like you really should have a map you trust and feel good with, physical or on your phone or whatever other device you use. If you've heard of a cougar in the area, it could just be a good idea to wait till that, either the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife says that we haven't seen a cougar there for a few months is probably fine, or whatever. I think it's just a good rule of thumb in general. When I go bushwhacking, is stay away from places where cougars have been sighted, or especially cougars acting strange, which happened near my house recently. Reports of a strange cougar. You don't know if you're going to be on private property or public property without a good map. So if you are unsure, I would say defer to not going across property that you don't know is public. It's very unfortunate. We live in the United States of America, where we view private property as like the most sacred right. And if you infringe on that right, it's actually a really big deal, and it can be you can be legally responsible, and even scarier, sometimes people will become violent if you're crossing their property, or at least make threats of violence. So just be safe and be smart, and have a good map, and know where you are on the map, so you don't actually cross private property. All right, some other general tips. Once again, sorry, this is just like a block of text, but there's good stuff here, believe me. So general tips: spend time beforehand getting the right map. It is so worth doing some homework, spending 25 minutes with the map, poking around it, really familiarizing yourself with it before you show up in the woods. It makes all the difference. Just believe me, it really does. Two maps can really help corroborate information. Sometimes a map will be slightly off. Its border of the timber sale will be slightly off, or its location of this stream or of this ravine or whatever is slightly off. And having two maps to compare against each other is a great way to triangulate what's going on. That's not always doable, but it's a good tip if you can have two maps. Map your path using a tracking function. If you're using an app like Gaia or Onyx, or there are others. I think Avenza actually does do this. Pretty sure the latest Avenza does do tracking. Brel, you're nodding, so that looks like a yes.
It does.
Good. All right. So all the apps that we're recommending, they do allow you to track, and that really helps not only finding your way back, but also if you want to do a nice loop and check out a different stand on your way back to wherever you parked. It's a great way to kind of plan that out and stay safe. Also, later you can look at where you were and where you were not, so you can tell someone else like, "Hey, I haven't checked out these stands yet," and whatnot.
Can I add something real quick, Alex?
Please do. Go ahead.
On the topic of having different maps, my favorite thing to do is to have a unit detail map that's a zoomed in look at your unit, and a vicinity map that has like the context in which your unit is. And then if you can go gold standard, you should try and find a map that at least has a transportation layer, because that will save you. You should ask us, because we have a map. I think Steve actually shared a map that has all of the gates on it. So you can see where all the locked gates are on DNR property, which will save you lots of driving.
That is awesome. I need that GIS layer. So, okay. Of course, Steve has already done this. Yeah, just remember, there's some really talented people on this team who have already done a ton of work. So if you're like about to reinvent the wheel, maybe just ask around first. And Steve has probably already made the map. That's pretty much like, there's been like 5 maps. I've been like, oh, we need this. And then, oh, Steve's already done it. Okay, so going through this list, identify landmarks as you go. So this is like a general navigation skill. If you notice some like crazy looking snag, like take note of it, say it out loud, say, hey, check out this snag, whatever. Then you kind of get your bearings. And if you're starting to get turned around and you find that snag, your body and your mind will just remember a lot more of where you're at. So really take note of landmarks as you go. Don't traverse on hillsides that are dangerously steep. That's obvious, but like, let's be honest, some of us are living in the foothills of the North Cascades. Some of these timber sales are extremely steep. And there have been times where I'm like, the cool trees are down there, but I shouldn't do this. And you just have to say no. Definitely just say not worth it. Sometimes it's doable, but oftentimes it's not. Head back to the car, plenty of time to find your way back and drive out of there. You don't want to be pushing it close. Drop a pin on the map when you find something unique, and you can actually in Avenza or the other apps include some information. Say you're getting DBH, diameter at breast height, and you're measuring a bunch of trees in that area. You can just like drop pins with those measurements or whatever. Cruel snag was here, or owl nest was here, whatever. Use roads and trails as much as possible, even if you feel like it might be more mileage as the raven flies. It will save you time, because walking on a road is like 100 times faster than bushwhacking. And walking on a trail is also faster, slower than a road, but still much faster. So do your best to just use roads and trails as much as possible. So the apps that we're recommending to use, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, Avenza, OnX, and Gaia. I use Avenza and OnX. Avenza is free, and I'll be going through that in a minute of how to download Avenza and get hooked up to that. OnX is not free, but it is so worth it. I use this app constantly. This is the app on my computer, but you can also use the app on your phone. And I can go back and forth. Whatever I do on my phone shows up also on my desktop, and vice versa. So if I want to do some reconnaissance before a field visit and like trace out my route, you can see what I did here. I traced out a route, and then you can see my tracked GPS route as I climb Stewart Mountain to this timber sale. You can get KML files and upload them to your computer or to your phone, so that you actually can get outlines of timber sales. And we have these outlines if you're interested. This is one here in the Lake Whatcom watershed. This is Bellingham's watershed. This is the timber sale that's being cut actively. It's over 100 years old. Anyway, this is OnX. You can do really cool stuff with it. Most importantly, I should just show you this really quick. You can see private property and public property. Private, public. So check it out. Here's an area where you see blue is state land. This gold color is county land, and everything else, all the unmarked land, is private. You also get to see tribal land, and like sometimes conservation land will show up. And there's other random designations like municipal stuff and whatever. Military land will show up, all that kind of thing. You can click on an ownership. It will tell you the name of the owner and the taxing address and the acreage. So you can literally zoom in like anywhere and see properties outlined. This app has changed my relationship to navigating. It really has. It's like $25 a year. I think it's 25 bucks. So I would recommend OnX. The one that we definitely are recommending is Avenza, because a lot of the maps we're using are geo-referenced PDFs. If you don't know what that means, it's okay. You know what a PDF is. You can get a PDF onto your phone. Geo-referenced means that your location will show up on the map. I'll go through this really quick because if you're really interested in this, you can watch the recording and pause these slides and see these steps more closely. Essentially, you download Avenza, and then you're able to download a map, you email it to yourself, and then on your phone, there's different ways to do this depending on what kind of phone you have, but you're able to open it up in Avenza. And Avenza only, at least my Avenza, if it's free, the free version, you only get 3 maps that you import from an external source. Maybe others have been able to bypass this, but this is what I've run into. You can download their maps, which are USGS topographical maps, but they don't have as much information, and the maps that we're producing are way cooler. So I'd recommend importing your own. You only get 3 at a time, so you have to delete them as you import new ones. Essentially, what you see on the right is what it looks like on your phone. You are able to see your location as a blue dot, and you can drop pins either where you are or somewhere else at the stand, and include information, include notes about what you're seeing. You're also able to export data from your phone. So if you, for example, wanted to share with a friend, like, hey, I just checked out the sale, but I only looked at this lower portion of the unit. I didn't get to look at the other stand, the northern part of the stand, for example. You can export these pins to that person so that they can then import the pins and see where you went and where you have not gone yet. Really helpful. Once again, you can go back and look at the recording and pause this if you want to see more detail of how to use Avenza.
I'm
So
also happy to send out those slides if people want to look at the instructions. We've got a total document that walks you through all that people can reference.
great. Thanks, Sam. I want to bring your attention back to this map because this map, it is only in northwestern Washington, Whatcom and Skagit counties, but like I said, we're going to be producing these same types of priority maps throughout Western Washington. So say you're on the Olympic Peninsula, like a map is coming your way soon that basically identifies the name of these sales and when they are due to be sold. In our shared Google Drive, Steve has already put together a bunch of really awesome LiDAR maps. This is what they look like. The LiDAR maps are exactly what they sound like. LiDAR is this black magic technology that allows us to see tree height, canopy height, and it gets really fine-tuned. It gets really detailed. It's actually very accurate. You actually can walk to different parts of a sale and like find the mega tree based on what you're seeing. So for example, this is LiDAR showing this red color is the tallest one. It's 250 feet or more. And me and my buddy actually walked to this area. We actually got to find this stand, and it was amazing to see these giant trees. So you can like basically figure out what part of the sale is most important to go visit based on this, and then go to those clumps of dark green or red and make pins. You can make pins with the DBH. You know, you do your measurements around the trees and you get your DBH. We're running a little bit over time. So Sam, maybe you could walk us through this. You don't have to get into a ton of detail. Sam's basically going to tell us about what we're looking for when we're in these sales. Go for it.
Awesome. Yeah, I will keep it as an overview as much as possible. And then the offer always stands to dig deeper into any of this. So when we actually in the woods, we've decided where we're going to go, we've done all the preparatory things and we're in there, what are we actually looking for? And the answer really depends on what the proposal is, where it is, and who the management body is. And so my work in Oregon is very different than the work that I do in Washington with Center for Responsible Forestry. And our work with CRF really focuses on protecting, like I said at the beginning, legacy forests. And so the number one way that we've been successful, our campaign, our strategy is focused on identifying those old and complex and native forests and saving them from being proposed for logging. So that's what we're looking for. Old forest, complex / dynamic forest, native / never logged forest, contiguous, unroaded forest. That's a big swath connected. And then I'm adding unique plants and plant communities because we've had success a total of 1 time saving a forest that way. And I have high hopes that we can continue to do that more and more. Go ahead to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we tell if we're finding an older forest? Gonna just kind of go over very high level, the different kinds of forests and the different indicators of older complex forests that we would want to take in our notes, that we would want to document and write down and bring up to the Department of Natural Resources as proof that this is a forest worth saving. So this is not an old forest. This is a forest at the very beginning of its life. This is what the DNR calls ecosystem initiation, what other management bodies call early seral. There's a bunch of different euphemisms for it. It's basically like a clear cut or a high severity burn patch coming back, the beginning of its life. Next slide. This is the kind of next cycle. Again, lots of different names, competitive exclusion, sometimes called stem exclusion. It's when you're kind of noticing that you've got trees mostly of a single age class. You've got a little bit of an understory coming in there. I can see like maybe what looks like a young hemlock or some young hemlocks in the second story coming up. But the first age is kind of competing. Their crowns are competing for sunlight. Maybe some are dying out because it's too dark and dense in there. But you also have this like native undergrowth layer that's coming up. So that's the second phase kind of its life. Third phase is the development of that understory that I mentioned was kind of baby coming up. Now it's really coming up and you've got maybe 3 different age classes starting to emerge, really like looking at the different age classes and different levels and layers of the canopy. The more complex, the more old. And then this is like the old growth OG example, biomass accumulation. That's such a horrible and bland term for like beautiful old growth forest. I don't know why it's in this presentation. Get it out of here. This is OG and it's just, I like to say it's a mess in there. It's, lots going on. So let's talk about what the heck's going on in an old growth forest. OWLS. This is my favorite acronym. So if you're wondering what makes an old growth forest, this acronym helps us remember. O stands for old trees, also known as legacy trees. That sounds like a duh, but like you see big trees, probably an old forest, especially the more big trees you see, the more likelihood that that age class is older. W, woody debris. So like I mentioned earlier, with lots of wood on the ground, if you're in a nice forest, probably going to see a lot of downed wood. And so lots of nurse logs that are giving way to new life and just kind of like rotting wet wood on the ground. A layered canopy is the L, mentioned that already, multi-layered, multi-different species, multi-different ages. And then snags. Snags are the upright version of nurse logs, woody debris. They're standing dead trees and they're critter motels, basically. They're just providing tons of home and habitat to species and still storing carbon, despite what the timber industry might say. Next slide. So these are just some examples. We're going to go through them pretty fast, but old trees, this is the cedar that I mentioned measuring in the introduction. Largest tree I've ever measured that wasn't a Doug fir. Go ahead. This is what we mentioned this a couple times. Part of field checking is when you find a big tree, you measure it. And we also measure the average tree in a stand. So we'll usually do what is your average tree size of each species. And then you'll measure the biggest specimens in the unit. And so we do that at breast height, which is technically 4.5 feet. There's a funny story about why that is. You should ask me later. But 4.5 feet, we measure it, and we have special tapes that convert the circumference to diameter. So we don't have to do that complicated math. This is, just other ways that you can tell if a tree is old. How do I know if it's a legacy tree? Obviously, if it's big, but not always the size can tell. You can look for deep fissures in the bark, especially with Douglas firs. knots and branch whorls, kind of other abnormalities in the branching, we call epicormic branching. And then, like I said, we measure the diameter. And so those are some examples. Like I said, kind of like the more gnarly sometimes, often the older trees are, broken tops, stuff like that. Go ahead. We're going to skip this because this is technical and we don't always do that, but sometimes we do measurements of different kinds of trees per acre. But it's, again, not necessary, but something we can learn. This is just an old forest, vertical diversification. It's just like the profile of a classic old growth, that all of that stuff, the OWLS acronym, is going on here.
Sam, can I really quickly interject? So DNRs and BNR, Board of Natural Resources, they've made very clear that age is not the only variable they care about. And they repeatedly will push back if you say, hey, look, this forest is 150 years old and blah, blah, blah. They increasingly are moving away from old equals good and instead looking for old growth characteristics. And some of those characteristics are structural diversity, like what you see here. Structural diversity is both vertical and horizontal. You have some patches, you have shrubs, you have small trees, medium trees, large trees, giant trees, snags, dead trees that are on the ground. Like Sam said, the messier, the better. So structural diversity is its own objective of what we're looking for. When you see a forest that's just a total cluster of craziness, that could actually be a really good thing. The messier, the better oftentimes. Sorry for that interjection, but I'll go to the next slide.
No, it's good. It's all true. So snags, these are just a bunch of like beautiful forest examples. That's me hanging out with a really cool snag. Again, like you can send these photos to the Department of Natural Resources. We will, and we do. And they actually, this means something to them. The fact that this is in a forest. Go ahead. Just paying attention to native undergrowth, native species coming up in the understory, in the ground. Natural openings, this is another sign of older forest. That's especially native forest. A lot of like previously logged forests will be quite homogeneous. Like you won't see a natural opening. It'll just all be like the same age and the same kind of consistency. And these unlogged native forests have just like random effects, natural effects that have happened. And so you'll often see just a natural opening out of nowhere. And so we document that because it's, again, just an example, another indicator, a characteristic of these complex forests. This is just like a pop quiz for fun, but just kind of cool to look at these differences. These are all taken from our team. This is just kind of an example of one of the younger, maybe competitive exclusion this forest is in. Go ahead. This is a little bit older, but maybe also still competitive exclusion, you know, younger trees, homogeneous. And the next one is the beautiful one. Just to give you examples. This is clearly another old growth characteristic. So just getting a feel for what it's like. And this is just to say there's really not a lot of old growth forest left. So what Alex said is really important, that we're not just defending old growth, we're defending forests that have characteristics of old growth. Like that could be one day if they're not logged. And so you can take a look at this map later. It's a sad state of things, but we don't have a lot of old forest. And so that's what we're doing, is trying to find it and protect it. And there's one, I think you can zoom through these, Alex, and just go to the follow-up pieces. These are just, I really always can't help myself but load up on all these. These are, I guess we can pause for a sec here. This is just a photo of, these are some photos of the indicator species that you can find, riparian areas. So we kind of spent the whole time talking about old growth, which is good because that's really, we're looking for old forest, but we're also looking for other things like water. The DNR does a really good job typically of mapping their waterways, unlike in Oregon. But often we find wet areas, seeps, and marshes that aren't quite mapped. And so indicator species like the skunk cabbage are sometimes whispering to us that there's water, and we'll mark that on our events as well. Keep going through those. More skunk cabbage. Other things, habitat. So we always mark that. Burrows, that epicormic branching that I mentioned, that's a good habitat for spotted owl and also for marbled murrelet. They really like that branching. We always mark recreation when we see it. And that's because if people use it for things other than timber, then we want to make sure that the DNR is aware of that and caring for that. We mark anything that we see that's flagging. So flagging always means something, and we can look that up later. So take pictures of trees that are circled and marked, pin those, any flagging that you see that's useful information for us, timber sale boundaries. And then any other weird stuff. This stuff is weird stuff like fire impacts. If you're in a place that you didn't think burned and there's just like a severe burn area or a meadow that you didn't realize was there. Basically, field checking is forest investigation. It's trying to figure out the story of a place and document it with as much description as you can. And so we are in the very last piece, which is what to do with all that data. And I want to say that all of this stuff is iterative. So you go into the field and you come back and you have a bunch of stuff. Just ask, what do I do with all this data? And we'll help you. There's a bunch of different ways that we use it. This is one of the forms that we fill out. So this helps to kind of capture what you saw in the field. So this is page 1, and then the second one is page 2. It basically includes everything I just went over, just for your note-taking purposes. Also, Alex, do you have a link to that document? I just want to end with that document, I think. Just sharing like the steps of what to do with the data.
Totally. This one right here.
Yes. So let's scroll down to when you get home, or right after field checking works. So when you're in the field, you're taking notes. You're taking notes on your Avenza, you're taking handwritten notes, you're talking to your group, and you're taking a bunch of pictures. So that's kind of the data that you've collected is Avenza data, written notes, and your photographs. When you get home, we are asking that you upload all of that data to our shared drive. So we have a drive, and in it are all of our timber sales, and they're organized by unit. It's a beautiful masterpiece. And so throw everything in there, your field checking checklist / your notes, your map. If you took a picture of your map, all of your pictures and your Avenza data, plop it into a folder that you title with your name and the unit. And also, this is a process that we're always working on. So if we have a better way of organizing, we should talk about it. But this is how we've been doing it now.
I was going to say, if there's recommendations of how to improve, folks should let us know, because I feel like this is really one of the points that's most important that we're still figuring out. Something I will mention, just my own personal preference, you should edit your photos, meaning go through them and only upload the ones that are valuable to the shared drive. It will just help us down the road. If we need to look through that folder later to get like the top 5 photos, we'll look through, 30 photos instead of 150. So do a little bit of editing beforehand to kind of weed out the ones that didn't turn out.
Yes. So you're going to dump all your stuff in there, and then you're going to do a couple other things. You're going to send a note to our field team and say, hey, I went to the woods. You can attach your notes and your photos if you want, or just a little summary, but let people know like where you went, what you saw. It's good for our morale to know that we're getting out there together, but also it's good for us to know what's being covered and what, like if there's lingering questions, if you're like, and I didn't get to this part of the unit and I'm really hoping someone else can, that's like the kind of discussion we want to have in our listserv. So share it with your group, and then tell the world that you went to. So you can do that by posting on social media. We love to get stuff out on social media. We do have a social media person who is taking pictures and posting it. But again, we're all volunteers. So throw it up on social media, say where you went. You can write a letter to the editor about where you went. We sometimes we'll host campaigns and publish things in the newspaper. There's tons of different ways to do that. But also, I think one of the most important things is that you communicate to the DNR. This is something that people think is very complicated and can be a little bit intimidating, but it is not. All you need to do is send an email and just say, hey, I went to the woods. Here's what I saw. Here are the questions that I have. And I intend to go back. Letting the DNR know that humans all over the state are enjoying their state lands, especially the ones that are proposed for sale. And asking them questions requires them to answer those questions. And so it's really, really, really just simple dialogue. It doesn't have to be anything pretty. It can be totally just, in colloquial language, and we are happy to help you write your emails. But I would say best rule of thumb is do it as soon as you get home, because it's fresh in your mind and it really only takes a few minutes, but just send a little note to the DNR. That's it in terms of all of the stuff to do. Again, all the stuff is available for you. This is mostly just to get you excited about getting to the field and contributing to our uphill but potentially winning battle to save all the old forests in Washington.
Something to end on, this strategy works. It has worked in the past, and we're getting to the point where we have better and better tools to really find these obscure places in the woods and tell the story to the public in a relatively seamless fashion. And what it takes is being organized and being smart and being collaborative. And I hope all of us are willing to do those things. We can do this. And I wanted to end on this note. This is an example of, I think, one of our big campaign wins so far, landing this story in the Seattle Times. And I'm sure all of you have read it, but if you haven't, this is absolutely required reading. This is the kind of attention that I think we can continue getting down the road if we continue to build public awareness of these timber sales and continue working together on this campaign. So with that, we're a little over, but a few folks had questions in the chat. Feel free to ask them now. And if you have to dip out, feel free to do so. But yeah, now's a great time for questions. Thanks for sticking around for so long.
Christy, you asked a question about trespassing, which is a great question.
Oh, but you're muted, Christy.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I believe it was a smuggler cut that it was marked, no trespassing signs were put up by DNR. And so all of a sudden there's a lockout because there was attention to that cut. Can you speak to that? If DNR?
Yeah, basically that's exactly what happened. We're dealing with this on an ongoing basis, but basically as a reaction to the protests that happened and the chameleon timber sale, which was also in the Capitol, the department became kind of reactionary and afraid of protesters, and so began the process of trespassing people from their controversial timber sales. We actually, Center for Responsible Forestry Public Records requested all of this information from DNR, and if folks are interested in parsing through all of it, it's fascinating stuff, but we do know that that's a practice that they adopted because they were afraid of protesters and are continuing to do because of that reason. And we did encounter a couple more no trespassing signs at recent timber sales that were not the smuggler sale. So they're definitely continuing to do that specifically on the sales that they think are controversial.
So we probably need to be a little stealth in how much we let DNR know, do our field survey while we can. Would that be fair?
It's a really good question of strategy, actually, especially when we consider at what point we want to engage the DNR with questions. Because typically I would say email them as soon as you go. But if we are worried about them trespassing us right away, maybe we want to think about how we do that. It's a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Something I do want to just, oh, and Eric, your question could be next, but I wanted everyone to know that DNR land is robustly publicly accessible by pedestrian traffic. You can walk anywhere on DNR land as long as there's not an active timber sale or mining project. The public access is quite robust. Vehicular access is oftentimes restricted. But if you can get past the gates, you have a lot of freedom to camp, to hike, to check out timber sales and whatnot.
But the no trespassing signs are for pedestrians in
Yes.
timber sales, and that we think is actually not kosher. I think that there's a civil issue there because of what Alex just said. And because these signs are being erected long before the logging begins, it doesn't make sense for public safety. So it's an issue that we're taking up, but it's up in the air what the consequences are for people who are walking into a place that has a no trespassing sign out front of it. It's messed up.
Yeah, I just don't look good in orange. It's not my color.
What's up, Eric?
Well, I wanted to express my gratitude to Alex and to Sam. This was a very concise, very thorough presentation. And the work that the Center for Responsible Forestry has accomplished in the last several months is truly significant. That patch that you salvaged, you saved in Smuggler is beyond compare. And Christy and I and others on this call live very close by. We live near the Oracle Cut, or proposed Oracle Cut, and that's an adjacent ecosystem, and it's a beautiful, beautiful stretch of land. And I would just extend an open invitation to everyone on this call to come visit us. Come visit us down here in the Stony Creek watershed. Standing invitation will make it work. We'll do a simple hike up into some of these units. Like Alex said, there are some steep parts that are well worth stepping around. Don't go down. It's hazardous that way. And the cougar, I'm very grateful that you mentioned that, Alex, because they live here. These are our neighbors. And last thing I would say is the storytelling. Sam was talking about this, the storytelling that we do about what we observe and what we experience when we're in these woods. That's really important. And I think the more that we can tell a story about conservation, recreation, and education, that's the recipe for victory. That's the recipe for victory. Conservation, recreation, and education. And I think what you've done this evening is a powerful example of education on behalf of conservation, but you're also teaching us how to get out into the woods and to observe what we see there, which is a form of recreation. So deep respect, so great to be part of this project. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it meant a lot to hear all those nice words. And just so you know, we actually are planning to do an in-person summit statewide. All of us who are working on this across the state, we're planning to do something. It was going to be in July, but I think we're going to push it to August, just have a little bit more time to plan ahead of time. And we were thinking of the Capitol State Forest being the place where we all get together. So let's stay in touch. And if you have ideas about where that could be, if you would like to help us plan it, that would be really helpful. So anyway, you got my email, so feel free to reach out if you have any ideas or questions.
I think we should name it Interdependence Day, and we should just make it so.
That's awesome.
But seriously, if any of y'all who live near the Capitol State Forest want to help suggest ideas of places to camp, like dispersed camping, not actual campsites, if you know of like good sites that would work as group sites that probably wouldn't be occupied, holler. We're scouting. Awesome.
Are there any other questions? Maybe just one last question before we wrap up for the night. And feel free to reach out to Sam or myself by email later. That totally works as well.
Maybe we're all good.
All right. Well, this is recorded. I'll send around the YouTube link so you can share it with folks who weren't able to join. Yeah, thank you everyone for being a part of this. I really feel honored to be in such great company, and there's a lot of work to do, but I think we can do it. So if you have ideas, if you have questions, just reach out, and we'll keep on moving forward with it. Thanks.
Thank you all. Alex, it was asked to save the chat as well, so let's do that too.
Oh yes, I will do it.
Great. Thanks all.
See ya.